The thing about war is it really concentrates the mind. There was fear that the German system of technical schools and scientific education was far ahead of the English system.
During the First World War, education had inevitably not been the nation's priority. Schools and teachers struggled on as best they could, with reduced budgets, lack of staff, and deteriorating buildings. In Parliament, many agreed with the verdict of one senior MP who considered the education system to be in ruins.
What World War I did was highlight many of the tensions and concerns in the English education system, which had really been bubbling up since the late 19th century. And the thing about war is it really concentrates the mind. There was fear that the German system of technical schools and scientific education was far ahead of the English system. There was also concern, actually, that our level of history education was not nearly as good as it could be.
Large numbers of children left school at a very early age and didn't contribute very positively to what you might call a technically advanced labour force thereafter. There were, of course, enormous disparities in education. There was a large private sector which only a very wealthy few could go to, and the state system, though much better than it had been and free at the junior on the junior end, was still very inadequate, and it significantly needed reform.
In December 1916, the new coalition government under Lloyd George appointed a man called Herbert Fisher as president of the Board of Education, with a mission to make radical changes. It was always going to be a tough ask.
What Fisher tried to do was really bring some order to the structure, to give local authorities greater control. He tried to bring the religious schools under local authority control, but that didn't work, and also introduce a coherent system of examination. So this was a really major piece of reform, and at its heart, though, was keeping young people in school until they were 14.
The big novelty, very important one in the Fisher Act, was what they called the day continuation schools, something very dear to Fisher's heart, which meant that children between the ages of 14 and 18 would have the full opportunity to develop vocational and practical subjects. Fisher's reforms went on to deal with the link between secondary education and higher education.
To get backing for a new act, Fisher had to walk a political tightrope.
What's remarkable is that Fisher, who is this academic, comes into the world of Westminster and really delivers remarkable reforms between multiple competing interests. On the one hand, you had the demands of business, the Federation of British Industry, who wanted young people as a source of ready labour supply. On the other hand, you had academics and educationalists very keen to keep young people in education as long as possible. You had the schools, you had local authorities. As ever with education, you had multiple and competing interests.
Fisher's also very good at negotiating with the employers. To a degree, he was successful in negotiating with the trade unions as well, because the unions, rather oddly, had not thought of education as amongst their greatest priorities. Trade unions were also very careful about their ability to control the labour force by, of course, having them as members of trade unions, so they were somewhat apprehensive about that.
Fisher really, thanks partly to the support of the Prime Minister, manages to deliver a very effective education reform through that. And again, I think war concentrates the mind. When you've got that kind of massive event behind, actually getting people to focus their resources and agree on an outcome which might not be perfect, wartime provides that kind of contingency.
Fisher's legacy was to create an act in the middle of a war that once and for all established the idea that the purpose of education was not just to increase productivity or to teach religion, but to focus on the value of learning itself. Education should be provided, he said, to raise up the individual and increase the level of dialogue within the country.
Fisher kept his eye on the main objective, which was having a national comprehensive system which everyone would benefit from, and which inquiries during the war had suggested were not there.
I think what's so enriching about Fisher's work and the Education Act is this very strong belief in education in and for itself, and having to push back quite strongly against the business interests about getting young people simply trained for work. A very strong belief, coming as he did as an educationalist, as an academic, of the life-enriching virtue of the attributes of a liberal education for all young people. And that's why I think the 1918 Act is so heartening to look at again.
For more information about Parliament and the First World War, go to www.parliament.uk/WW1.